I think we're ready to move on to the main presentation. Today that's going to be given by Bill Schnabel. He is director of the Institute of Northern Engineering at UAF, and his background is in environmental engineering. He's been director at INE since 2015, and today he's going to be discussing what I was originally introduced as the Environmentally Threatened Communities Project, which is overseen by the Denali Commission and is a cooperative project among UAF, INE, and also the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, both the Alaska District and the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Lab. And with that, assuming all our audio and everything are working, I think we can turn it over to Bill.
You're muted, Bill.
Bill, you need to come off of mute.
Got off mute. Now
okay, and share screen.
Yep. Desktop.
You got it.
Yes. Okay, there we go. Thank you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you today electronically. We are in the midst of a very interesting project funded by the Denali Commission, and I have been, I'm lucky enough to have been selected to talk about the project, but I do want to start by introducing the project team. And the project team, the project itself is broken down into erosion, flooding, and permafrost. And today we're really going to be talking about permafrost. So the members of the permafrost component of this project are me and Billy Connor, Yuri Schur, and Misha Kanievsky, who are both in the room with me right now. Il-Song An, Aaron Trosham, and Kelsey Dean. Those are all UAF affiliated people. We are also working with Corel, and Kevin Biela and Ariel Ellison are on the Corel team, and I'm pretty sure Kevin is on the call. I think I saw his name come up. And the project is being funded by Denali Commission. So the scope of the overall project, it's a collaboration between UAF, Corel, as well as the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, again, funded by Denali Commission. UAF and Corel, our job is to think about the threats to infrastructure in Alaska communities imposed by thawing permafrost, now as well as in the future. And the Corps is going to be looking at the threats to infrastructure in Alaska communities posed by coastal or riverine erosion, as well as flooding. And they're going to base their work on the 2009 baseline erosion assessment, as well as look at flooding and incorporate that into the assessment. Now, the tricky part about this is we're trying to come up with kind of an overall environmentally threatened communities metric. You know, what are the combined threats of flooding as well as permafrost thaw, or erosion plus permafrost thaw? And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because those different threats fall in different time scales and so forth. So trying to understand what is the overall threat to a community is not necessarily straightforward. In any event, the purpose of today's talk is to focus on the permafrost component of that question. So again, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at flooding, erosion, and permafrost. However our evaluation comes out, we don't expect that we're going to come up with a number like 4.5 or whatever that is, but rather they're going to be more general, such as high, medium, low, or minimal risk. I think that's probably as close as we're going to be able to get to prioritizing or ranking the threats because of the because the threats are so different. Again, this is a team effort, meaning to us that while we tend to think about permafrost a lot, it's going to require a really interdisciplinary approach to think about what is the overall threats. And we're going to try to come up with a map at the end. So users, stakeholders, planners can look at this map and try to get a feel for where are problematic areas. When we started thinking about the infrastructure threats associated with permafrost, one idea that we came up with is that really permafrost thaw is where that intersects with infrastructure is really a very, very localized problem. We're very much interested in what does the permafrost, what are the characteristics of the permafrost beneath the structures that we're interested in. So, and that's important because right now we're producing a good number of regional style permafrost maps, which are, I think, give us a lot of good information, general regional information, and what do we expect is going to happen in the future, and so on and so forth. But with respect to understanding whether or not a specific structure is under threat, these sorts of maps are not going to be high enough resolution. We need to know what's going on underneath the structures. And we also put a lot of thought into what does a threat look like with respect to permafrost. Do we expect sudden catastrophic failures of buildings? And really, I think the answer is probably no. In most instances, we're going to see a slow degradation, a slow, you know, suddenly the doors don't shut very well, and suddenly over time your floors are beginning to slope and so forth. And at some point, the building becomes unusable, unsafe, whatever. But it's a pretty slow degradation generally with respect to structures. One exception to that is underground utilities can degrade fairly rapidly when we're running warm water through cold soil. Some things that have a large impact on whether or not a community is susceptible is things such as drainage. Ponding tends to increase permafrost thaw. So if we get, is the drainage in a community done well, and so forth. All of those things come into play when we're thinking about, is a community susceptible? Also, we need to know what type of permafrost we're talking about. So for example, if something is built on alluvial gravels, even if it's the permafrost thaws, well, maybe it's not really such a threat because we don't necessarily tend to see a lot of settling there. However, if something is built on ice-rich yedema, maybe that's a little bit more susceptible. And it's not always easy to know from looking above whether or not we're on alluvial gravels or yedema. At least not easy for me. Maybe, maybe it is for some other people. So in kind of thinking about all of these considerations, we put a lot of time and effort into predicting or understanding what sorts of damage we might see. And so let's just go through this flow chart a little bit. And so one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is do we have a risk of permafrost degradation? And I wonder, Sarah, can you give me a thumbs up on whether or not you can see my pointer as I'm moving it on my screen? Okay, good, perfect. Well, and this is a little bit out of order, but in any event, if we ask ourselves, is there a risk of permafrost degradation? Do we expect that the mean annual ground temperature is going to be above 0? And we think that is the case. The next question is, are the soils thaw susceptible for instance? Do they have a lot of silt in them? And if they're not thaw susceptible, well, we don't necessarily have a risk of thaw settlement, but we do have a risk of permafrost degradation if they are ice-rich soils, if there are large ice bodies in there. If the soils are thaw susceptible, and then we'll again ask ourselves the question, do we have massive ice in there? And if so, then we have a higher level of risk. If not, then we still have risk, but not as much. And we can, I don't have to go through all of them, but we bring ourselves through a flow chart like this to figure out what sorts of risks do we think we're going to encounter. And the reason this is relevant is we put up a matrix, we built ourselves a matrix to understand, to kind of translate those risks into answering the question, what is the overall risk, permafrost risk in a community? So let me step back. In this left-hand column, we have, do we expect there to be hazards? Small, no hazards, all the way up through extreme hazards. And those are associated with, well, for instance, extreme hazards equate to major structural damage. The way that we envision investigating whether or not these communities are at risk is twofold. One is to look at the existing structural damage to find existing structures to see if there's reported damage. So this is column A. And then we look at the soils themselves to understand whether or not we believe the soils are susceptible to permafrost risk. So, for example, if we look at a community and, you know, so far none of the structures seem to have undergone any damage. There may be a little bit of cosmetic damage, but there's no reported distress and so forth. Well, we have no reason to believe, at least from the structures themselves, that we're going to have permafrost problems. Then if we look at the soil conditions at the community, we'll look at things such as ground temperatures. We'll look at the types of foundation the structures are on. We'll look at the utilities, and so on and so forth. So given our last two slides, we will need information to go into those matrices. And so right now we are in the process of looking at information that is available at a list of 200 communities in Alaska to understand from the safety and comfort of our offices whether or not we believe that the communities are at risk for permafrost degradation, whether the infrastructure is at risk for permafrost degradation. So, and what we're doing is using information we can get from DOT, using information we can get online, and whatever other sources are available. And we're answering questions about, whether or not, what do we know about the permafrost in the region? We're asking questions about whether or not permafrost has been observed. What information do we have on the soils? Do we have any measurements on ground ice and so forth? Is there reported thaw settlement? We're looking at satellite imagery when possible to see if we can see ice wedges. We are looking at any reports on hazard mitigation plans, existing hazards, and so forth. And so we're using information that we're gathering here and putting that back into our decision matrix I showed in the last slide to come up with some measure of susceptibility to infrastructure damage from permafrost. Right now, I think our list is 200 long or something like that. We're not done with it yet, but moving as quickly as we can to get to it. In addition to us looking at information that we can, reported information, we are sending out community surveys to try to get, to do two things. One is to try to understand information that's already out there and allow people the opportunity to talk with us. But the larger, an important purpose of those surveys is to open up a link between us, this project team, and community members, because we believe that when we start talking about threats and start talking about the results of this project, that people, it may garner more attention for the project within the communities, and we want to have a line of communication opens so that people can send more information about their communities. So we have a survey that is online that we have put together, that we have attempted to get out into the communities. And actually, I would be more than happy to send that survey to the members of this group. And if anybody has any observations they'd like to send to the team, that would be perfect. Some of the information we're getting from these surveys are, what sorts of facilities are in the communities, foundation types, conditions, any of those observations that we're just not going to be able to get looking at satellite photos or from our offices here in Fairbanks. Data preservation is an important aspect of this project. We've already been gathering a whole bunch of data, and so we've put together a database to hold information on our reports that we will have available at the end of the project. It would be great if we were able to take this database at the end and keep it up and allow anybody to continue using it and adding to it. I think that's probably a conversation for towards the end of the project, but we're going to have a nice deliverable. Some of the challenges that we have so far seen with this project is it's difficult to obtain data for so many different communities. We've gotten data from DOT because many communities have airports and roads, and we have obtained some geotechnical data from consultants, but there's a lot of it in there, a lot of data out there that we're still trying to obtain. I guess that's it. And I would like to open it up for questions. And I'd also like to invite my team members, Misha and Yuri, to feel free to answer questions. I believe Kevin Biela is on the phone too, who is available to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Vladimir, it's Vladimir here. I have many, but we can talk, offline. We are same campus. I have maybe one question. So far, you're talking about present day situation. It's very important to, of course, get the kind of understanding what is going on right now. But in terms of the future, so you will have to go to some modeling exercise to see what permafrost will be doing in the future, near future, farther future. And these models should be very, very high resolution. What do you think about it? What is the plans for that?
That is a great question, Vladimir, and I appreciate it. My feeling on it is that right now, the spatial resolution of our knowledge, I don't think we have enough information right now to understand overall what is the current situation. We still need more information on what are the existing conditions under our infrastructure look like. And so the point of this project is to try to get the best handle as possible on what are the existing conditions. And then clearly the next step is to figure out, okay, if these are the conditions now, what do we think it's going to be 30 years hence, and so forth. And for that, we're going to need very highly spatially resolute models for the infrastructure, for the ground conditions. One thing we should consider, though, when thinking about that, is the design life of the infrastructure. And so if the design life of a house, for instance, is 40 years, do we need to think about 100 years out for that particular house?
I think for this specific modeling interaction of buildings and with environment, the main characteristic will be air temperature, because there are some existing models to predict permafrost condition under the structures. But the air temperature, for example, will be maybe the most important characteristics. And I don't know now how it's trustful what can be predicted for 20, 30 years, what air temperature will be at that range of time.
Thank you.
Hey, Bill. This is Andrew. I wanted to thank you for your, excuse me, your presentation. It was really interesting. And I also wanted to point out a question which was asked by Ryan Toohey of the Climate Science Center in the chat section, and point that out to you. It says, hello, what's the scope of the project? Is it the 4 villages mentioned on slide 10?
Oh, no, it is, it's basically all of Alaska. And I showed the slope. Yeah, so those were just examples on slide 10. And there are all the communities in Alaska. There were a list of 34 communities that had come out in a previous report that we already know are threatened. So we're not necessarily focused on that because we're already pretty sure what the threats are there. But yeah, so for the permafrost component, for example, we are on communities where we simply know there is no permafrost. We're not paying attention to those. But yeah, it's statewide.
This is Christina. Can I ask another question? Who gets those surveys? How do you select the people, or yeah, who fills out the surveys you send to the villages?
We would love for to get more surveys filled out. So when we were writing the surveys, we were thinking about how can we best get this survey to people that are going to understand, have a pretty good understanding of the structure of public buildings in communities. So we're actually thinking about, boy, it would be great if we could get this to the water plant operators and maintenance personnel. I think that we have not done as good of a job as I'd like to in getting that out there. One of our team members went to the Alaska Federation of Natives conference and tried to get it out there. We've talked with ANTHC to try to get it out, but we still haven't received as many responses as I'd like to see.
Because I was thinking, so it's not going out to individual households, is it?
It's not, only because I don't have an email list of individual households. But the survey is a Google form. It's a Google survey, and it is not a problem at all to disseminate it as broadly as possible. and we're asking the respondents to provide a little bit of information about themselves and who they are and what they're representing, just to give us an idea on how best to interpret what they say. But for us to get the survey out there, if we can get enough attention for it, it's easy. We just email it to people.
Hey, Bill, this is Andrew again. Christina sort of got at something that is kind of a pair for my question as well. You mentioned that you were willing to share the survey with folks on this call. I wonder if it would be appropriate or helpful to you guys to use the IARPC website, and also possibly the fact that we have folks like Tom Hennessy, who is one of the team leads for the health and well-being team. I'm trying to use that as a way to help you guys out, getting better responses and better visibility out there for the survey.
That would be great. I'd absolutely like to do that. And that would actually be a good way of getting, well, yeah, I will send you that link and get that information to you, Andrew, and ask that I'll invite the people on this call to give us a day or so, and then please refer back to the IARPC website, and we'll have a link to that survey on there. And
okay,
yes,
great. Yeah, we'll after the call, we'll figure out some of the details of that and get that going.
Perfect.
Hi, Bill, it's Alexander Holodov. I also could recommend you, if you're familiar with LEO network, Local Environmental Observation Network, managed by Mike Brubaker, you can establish a project and people can report some observation of damages and deformations of infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexander. I will do that.
Alexander, could you put the URL to that project into the chat window?
I need to find, but you can, well, give me a second. Yeah, I can do it.
Thanks.
Bill, this is Tom Hennessy from CDC. My question is related to kind of the scope of your project. And I mentioned earlier, we're really interested in the impact of permafrost thaw on water and sanitation systems. And I can see where what you presented would take into account impact on, say, a water treatment facility. But I'm wondering about whether you're also including into your project impact of permafrost thaw on source water, say upstream from surface water, silting, that might have an impact on filtration of a water and sanitation system, or if you're looking at sewage lagoons or the boardwalks and roads in a community that would be needed if they, for example, had a haul system.
We are, to the extent possible, Tom, recognizing that those, so for instance, catastrophic failure of a sewage lagoon would clearly be an important thing. And to the best of our abilities, we're looking at that, at those sorts of issues. But there's only so much we're going to be able to learn from. This is really a desktop study. And so there's only so much we're going to be able to learn from our offices about individual systems. So I think we're going to, and we're asking for those sorts of information that in the observations in the survey. And so if a community reports that they've been having problems, with their water, sewer lines and so forth, we're going to take that into account. So I guess I would give that a cautious yes. We're looking at those sorts of issues.
With regard to permafrost and surface water sources, do you think there's a way to anticipate where permafrost may interact with streams that would cause potential for slumping and increase in silt and organic matter being deposited? Or would you be relying on communities that are already reporting that?
I think we would most likely rely on communities that have already reported that. this project does take into account erosion. And so that some of that might be incorporated into the erosion component of it, which we still haven't gotten the data from the Corps yet, but we're going to add that in. I would, you know, in thinking about erosion, we're probably thinking more about structural issues associated with erosion versus water quality, but if there's reports of it, we'll take it into account.
Okay, well, I think that's where Alexander's comment about use of the LEO network and some of the other outreach tools that we have for getting observations from community may really help with your project. And we can do what we can to link you up and try to expand the reach of your survey as appropriate.
That would be great. I appreciate that, Tom, because I personally believe that this is going to be a conversation. We're doing what we can now to try to get our arms around these threats, both permafrost and erosion and flooding. But those threats aren't going to stop when the project ends. And so one thing we are developing is trying to develop is a lines of communication. And so, yeah, we'd appreciate that.
Good morning. This is Don Antrobus with the Denali Commission. Hey, I just wanted to add a couple of things. I think, you know, one thing that's important to understand is the impetus for this project. As Bill mentioned, there's an earlier GAO report that identified about 31 communities that are environmentally threatened. That study was based solely on a 2009 erosion assessment done by the Corps. What we'd like to do is to update that information and incorporate into the analysis not only the erosion, but the permafrost degradation that Bill is talking about, and a flooding component as well, so we can create this combined threat score for communities. And what we'd like to do is to better understand the relative threat that's out there. You know, we know 31 are threatened, but we also know there's a lot more than that. So we want to update that understanding and hope to put together some type of a community-based score that can be utilized by, you know, other entities, by federal and or state agencies that are trying to determine how to best use their investments. You know, perhaps the scoring system will allow them to go to where the greatest threats are, rather than to perhaps the communities that are the best grant writers. So that's how we hope to utilize the data in the end. One of our project stipulations to Bill was that he use existing data. So there were a few questions about making some projections regarding what's going to happen with permafrost out into the future. That's a little bit beyond his scope, you know, because we're asking him to make the projections based on the data that we have available today. We recognize that that's static and it'll have to be updated into the future at some point. That's one of the reasons we want to have a pretty robust database to capture all of this data, so that, you know, it can be picked up again in the future and advanced a bit further.
Hi, this is Renee. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had made a note on the Zoom chat, but Sarah had suggested that I bring this up verbally. In terms of having the survey filled out, have you thought about reaching out to the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, DSHM? They manage what's called the Small Community Emergency Response Plans, SCRPs, and there are usually points of contacts for each of those communities. And I would imagine that those folks would be very interested in looking at your survey.
Thank you, Renee. So it's Department of Homeland Security and
Emergency Management, DSHM.
Emergency Management. Okay.
I'll provide the name, the point of contact that I've dealt with regarding these SCRPs on the chat box.
That would be great.
Fabulous.
I have a question, if I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Koli Shiklamano from the George Washington University. I really appreciate that you are using our data, both our Calm and Server Blood's, TSP, GTNP projects. However, majority of our sites are located in undisturbed conditions. And when we are talking about the infrastructure, right, so it's predominantly located in areas of pretty significant anthropogenic disturbance. So the ground thermal regime can be modified quite substantially. And I just, how do you reconcile that, right? So it might be simply the sensitivity of permafrost or whatever forcing can be quite different in undisturbed conditions versus kind of middle of the town.
But Nikolai, an undisturbed condition is easier to manage than undisturbed conditions.
No, I understand that. No, I completely understand that. But when you are trying to rank your, your town according to the risks, and you are relying only on undisturbed condition data. No, I'm not suggesting that you don't have any other data, but maybe you have. But that can lead to some sort of a misleading results. Don't you think?
No, so far it's first stage. It's undisturbed conditions. It's mainly permafrost property. We gather information on permafrost properties.
Oh, I see. No, but no, they were, I mean, Yuri, I'm not going to, argue, but they were like actively sickness and permafrost temperature, right? So which can be quite different. No, it's, I'm just asking, I'm not.
No, if you have good understanding what permafrost looks like, and boundary conditions, and undisturbed conditions, in this case, much easier to handle, disturbed conditions, much easier to handle from the interaction point of view and environment and permafrost. Because undisturbed conditions, compared to disturbed conditions, it's extremely difficult subject.
I have a short comment towards what Nikolai Kola just said. I would be kind of ask you to be very careful with relating temperature of permafrost to stability. Because, well, examples where massive ground ice is very close to the surface, permafrost could be very vulnerable even if it's -10 or -14 below Celsius. So be very careful not to overestimate stability just based on permafrost temperature.
Vladimir, we already considered this situation. So there are several different categories of risks, including the risk of, for example, ice wedge degradation, which may occur under very cold temperatures.
I have a small comment.
Included in our system of estimation.
I also have a small comment to this discussion. At one of your slides, it was a definition like in places where mean annual ground temperature is at the permafrost table is above 0. But actually mean annual ground temperature, it's like what Vladimir told, might be still negative. But the warmest temperature can be, during summertime, can be above 0. And it will initiate melting of ground ice and permafrost, like not permafrost, surface subsidence. And then it will be more snow. Yeah, this one. So it's the very top. So maybe the mean annual ground temperature is not the best indicator, the warmest temperature. Might be
but
better.
It's an indicator of degrading permafrost.
Sometimes one extremely warm, one extremely warm year can initiate thermokarst, and it's more important than long-term sustainable trend. And the mean annual ground temperature is more like reflects the long-term trends. But for extremely warm years, maybe a summer temperature might be more important.
But it's all about seasonal depths of thaw, not about permafrost below.
Yes, but you know, to
maximum time, it's not necessarily the warmest summer. It would be the wettest summer.
Wettest summer or warm winter, but it will be like the temperature during summer period at the permafrost table.
Alexander, believe me, we know this permafrost 101.
I have no doubts, but it just yeah, because on your slide it was mean annual ground temperature, I think. Yeah.
It's one of the characteristics.
Yeah, it was a little bit kind of confusing because you showed only one, you know, the kind of criterion of stability and didn't show anything else. So that's my comment based on that. So of course, if you have some another you know criteria like ice, massive ice, and how close it to the surface, so then combination of this could give you kind of dangerous conditions, even if permafrost temperature is still pretty low.
Vladimir, I believe if Misha takes care of it, you should be safe on this point.
and I guess this has another thing that we need to consider, or that we certainly are considering, is the fact that you know, permafrost is not homogeneous throughout a community, and you know, people are building structures. Well, gosh, maybe they're going to build on the good soil that they know is the good soil, and not on the permafrost soil if they have a choice. And also, different structures have different, you know, they're built differently, and some structures may be more resistant to thaw than others, and so on. So there are a lot of unknowns out there that make this a challenging yet interesting study.
Well, Bill, this is Andrew again. Clearly, this project and presentation resonated at a number of levels across disciplines and institutions here. And I hate to do it because the discussion's been so good, but we're sort of bound to the hour that we're given for the webinar. That said, it seems like there are a number of connections for follow-up after the meeting, and clearly we can use the website for that, and folks' contact information is on there as well. Also, to remind folks again that the contributions of Renee and Alexander, and I think a few others now as well, are also in the chat box at the moment, some links and references to other institutions and groups. So at this point, we do kind of need to wrap up the meeting and mention that our next meeting is, I believe, the 19th of February. We're always on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern time, which is 10 a.m. Alaska time. I don't believe we have a title for the main talk for that meeting yet, but we will be having that meeting. And of course, you can go to the IARPC website to get details of that as the date approaches. In the meantime, are there any other really brief announcements or relevant things that people need to share at this point?
Andrew, this is Bill. I just have a point of clarification. Are those links that are in the Zoom chat box, are you going to transcribe those onto the IARPC website so we can get to them?
Yeah, we're going to capture all that and get it into the website.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Sure, appreciate your time.
Okay. Oh, and likewise. Yeah, this was a great discussion to listen to. I really enjoyed it. And it sounds like we're at a great point to wrap it up. So again, thanks, Bill. Really appreciate the presentation. Thank you all for joining us today, and look forward hopefully to seeing you next month as well.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.